unfortunately. No one wanted it to be this meaningful at this point, but that is what has happened. So I'm going to introduce the first of our speakers, Bob Spies, and he will take it from there. Although this is a somber occasion in light of yesterday's events, I can't resist a lighter note of telling you how I came to first know Bob. 2-3 years ago, whatever it was, I did a petition on Roots Action, calling upon Nancy Pelosi to co-sponsor the Green New Deal. And so you know how these things work. 5,000 people signed up, which was the limit. And part of the process is if you want to do a delivery to the person's office and you want to have a meeting in advance, that's part of the program. So I invited the 5,000 people to Cafe La Boheme on 24th Street. And I was afraid that they would all show up, you know, and that there wouldn't be enough coffee. But what in fact happened is Bob showed up, and me, and that was it. And so we had a chance to get to know each other, which we wouldn't have had if the other 49, 108, 98 had showed up. That is how I met Bob. And somewhere along the line, he actually told me about this particular interest and knowledge that he had of Ukraine, and much of what he knew about from his experience of being in Ukraine was very different than the conventional wisdom that most people had. Now, I had some myself. I was an observer for the election that Tymoshenko got elected, and before she got sent to jail. Unfortunate part of the history of recent Ukrainian politics, one after the other, that sort of happens. But I didn't know any of the things that Bob was talking about, particularly about Crimea, which he's going to talk about in detail. How did Bob wind up doing this? He tells me that, well, back in the 80s, he was just a guy who had an interest in world peace. And as you may recall, there was a big anti-nuclear weapons movement at that time. And he became involved in that. And as we all know, that issue somewhat faded away when the Soviet bloc no longer existed. And the main interest in the Soviet bloc in the West was trying to figure out how to make money from the reorganized Russian economy, and that faded away. When the Ukraine issue came up in the series of events that are generally referred to as Maidan in 2014, it re-sparked a lot of people's interest. What is the story in this country? And Bob was one of those people. And he was fortunate enough to go there 2 years later in 2016. And as I say, have an eyewitness view of things there that very few people in this country, I think, have had that kind of exposure to. So that's who Bob is in the relevant parties, much more than that, of course. But that is how he comes to be talking to us here tonight. And with that, I would like to turn it over to you, Bob.
Great. Thank you, Tom. And yeah, it was, I'm sorry that I was the only person who showed up that day, but it was a wonderful chance to get to know you, which has been a really nice thing in my life. Hi, everybody. As you might guess, a lot has happened since we agreed to do this presentation. Before we get started, though, I want to make something very clear. Much of this presentation deals with how we believe we got to where we are right now. And that includes an unwise multi-year US and NATO escalation along Russia's borders and covert support of the so-called Western side in the Ukrainian conflict that's existed since 2014. We believe these actions helped influence Russia to take the steps it's taken now. Regardless, however, in no way are we saying that we condone Russia's current military action. In addition to the humanitarian disaster military actions cause, they rarely result in what their planners expect. And now when we're talking about a nuclear armed country in a proxy conflict with another nuclear armed country, there's the potential for the ultimate catastrophe. War is obsolete as a means of solving problems, and all countries need to recognize that. I'm going to switch to some screen sharing now. So I get this working again. Okay. Can somebody just like Shirley nod just to make sure that you can see it? Awesome. Thanks. As I mentioned, I'm Bob Spies. I'm a web developer. I don't claim any substantial expertise when it comes to Russia or Ukraine, and I haven't written books or articles. But I'll explain how I got involved with all this shortly. My presentation partner, NATYLIE BALDWIN, is another story. She's a very accomplished researcher and writer. Her books, The View from Moscow and Ukraine, Zbig's Grand Chessboard, cover much of the material we're going to discuss today. NATYLIE and I are very grateful for the considerable help putting this presentation together we received from Larissa Hegg, who was born in Ukraine but lives here now, and I believe is on the call. So here's NATYLIE, who's going to talk about relevant Russian and Ukrainian history leading up to the critical events in 2014, and then I'll take it from there. NATYLIE?
Thank you, Bob. Good evening. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting us to speak tonight. And I'd like to thank everybody for participating in this meeting. I wish we were meeting under better circumstances. I think the events of the last few days have been very sobering. And in many ways, it makes this conversation more difficult to have, but I think it also makes it more crucial to have. My portion of tonight's presentation will be divided into two parts. The first part will be a historical overview of the relationship of Russian and Ukrainian peoples. Bob, if you could please put map number 1 up on the screen. Thank you. Ukraine, along with Russia, constituted a loose federation of East Slavic tribes known as warrior traders, ruled by the Rurik dynasty from the 9th through the 13th centuries. Ties were buttressed by a shared Orthodox religion due to Prince Vladimir choosing that religion for people of the Kievan Rus area in the 10th century. By the time of the Mongol invasion of the 13th century, the area had degenerated into rivalries among various princes who lorded over a dozen or so independent areas. The Mongol massacre killed about 2/3 of the population. Some of the survivors managed to flee closer to what is modern-day Moscow, and those who remained were forced into subjugation. Slavic bonds were ruptured by the Mongol takeover. Those from the southern part of the Kievan Rus region later became known as Ukrainians and were cut off and later ruled over by Poles and Lithuanians. In the mid-17th century, a treaty united Ukraine to Russia as an autonomous region and in turn led to a 13-year war between Russia and Poland, which resulted in the division of Ukraine between Poland and Russia. From then on, the Ukrainian-speaking parts of Poland-Lithuania were progressively conquered by the Russian Empire, leading many Orthodox Ukrainians to strongly identify with Russia. From the late 18th century on, Russians referred to Ukraine territory as Malorussia or Little Russia, viewing Ukraine and the Ukrainian language as having emanated from the greater Russian history and culture, and later sought to standardize it to Russian. Map number 2, please. The western parts of modern-day Ukraine were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the 19th and early 20th centuries, while the southeastern portion was part of the Russian Empire. Map number 3, please. An independent Ukrainian state emerged very briefly in the years of the Russian Revolution and early Civil War period, but the project failed in 1919. From then until World War II, parts of Ukraine were ruled by Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Soviet Russia, the latter becoming a Soviet republic ruled by the Communist Party. Russian and Soviet rule of Ukraine in the 19th and 20th centuries created complex patterns of migration, with significant parts of southern Ukraine settled by Russians, including those who came to work in the mines and factories of the Donbas region, bringing the Russian language with them. Map number 4, please. In 1991, Ukraine gained independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It probably comes as no surprise, based on the history I've outlined above, that there are ethnic, cultural, and linguistic divisions within the country. There are generally two different and irreconcilable views of how to organize the Ukrainian state. The first is monism. This is the belief that Ukraine is a single cultural and political entity. The political philosophy underpinning this view is heavily influenced by the Galician ethno-nationalist identity of Ukraine, rather than a civic or pluralistic one. It advocates for the Ukrainization of society, including a unitary state with no federalization and one language. It seeks to restore an idealistic vision rather than reflect the current complicated reality. It partly draws on the thinking of those who were trying to create the independent state that failed in 1919. That failure was subsequently blamed on democracy, liberalism, and a lack of will, paving the way for fascist sympathies. In the early 1930s, Ukrainian ultranationalists, led by Stepan Bandera, violently resisted Polish rule in Galicia. In 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Germany and the Soviet Union made Galicia part of the Soviet Union, a region that had never been under Russian imperial rule, and today remains the most strongly nationalist and anti-Russian part of Ukraine. When the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Ukrainian ultranationalists supported Germans, thinking that they would assist in the creation of an independent Ukraine. The Ukrainian ultranationalist army, who were supporters of Bandera, massacred around 70,000 Poles in 1943, and is estimated to have killed a total of about 130,000 in eastern Galicia by 1945. Statues of Bandera have been erected throughout Western Ukraine starting in October of 2007. Streets have been named after him, and a giant portrait of Bandera was displayed on stage at the Maidan protests of 2013 to 2014. The other philosophical viewpoint for the organization of a modern Ukrainian state is pluralism.
Can I ask everybody to make sure to mute, by the way? Thank you.
Pluralism acknowledges that Ukraine has a common ancestry with Kievan Rus and emphasizes a civic Ukrainian identity rather than an ethno-nationalist one. The pluralist approach says that cultural, ethnic, and linguistic diversity must be acknowledged and respected. It believes in a degree of decentralization. Support for this is complicated, however, by the fact that centralization benefits certain financial and political interests, namely oligarchs. I will now switch to part 2 of my presentation, which will discuss what has shaped Russia's current perceptions of its national security. Map number 5, please. Russia has a distinct history and geography that has shaped how it perceives its security interests. Unlike the US, which has an ocean on either side and friendly or benign neighbors to the north and south, Russia does not have natural barriers to invasion like oceans and mountain ranges. Hence, it has been invaded numerous times from different directions in its history. The most notable are the Mongols twice in the 13th century, Napoleon in the 19th century, and the Nazis in 1941. Most adults, middle-aged or older, in Russia today have relatives within living memory who lived through World War II. The Nazi invasion resulted in 27 million deaths of Soviet citizens, mostly Russian and Ukrainian. 19 million were civilians, and 1/3 of the country was destroyed. By comparison, the US lost around 400,000, mostly combatants, in the war and saw no fighting on its homeland. Many have heard of the siege of Leningrad, which lasted for around 900 days and resulted in 800,000 deaths from starvation, disease, and bombings. But there was also a siege of Moscow that killed around 1 million before it was over. One of the main routes of invasion for the Nazis was through the Ukrainian corridor. This history played a major role in Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev's hesitancy to allow a reunified Germany into NATO in 1990. According to documents released by the National Security Archive in December of 2017, Western representatives, including then Secretary of State James Baker, did in fact promise Gorbachev that there would be no further expansion of NATO eastward if he agreed to the reunification of Germany and its inclusion in NATO. After the Cold War, the French and German leadership believed that the best way to bring Russia into the Western fold and encourage its evolution as a democracy was through cooperation and gradual integration. However, many in Washington developed a triumphalist attitude. After years of heavy lobbying by the US arms industry and political groups, including neoconservatives, along with domestic politics involving Americans of Central and Eastern European descent, President Bill Clinton broke that promise in 1999 when Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary were brought into NATO. This was followed by the entry of Romania, Bulgaria, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Slovenia, and Slovakia in 2004 under the Bush II administration. Bush also pushed for Georgia and Ukraine to be brought into NATO. Due to the opposition of France and Germany, it was agreed at the Bucharest summit in 2008 that Georgia and Ukraine would become NATO members at some point in the future, but no date was set and no membership action plan was offered. 2 years before, during a 2006 meeting with then National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, Vladimir Putin tried to impress upon Rice that efforts to bring Ukraine into NATO would be disastrous all the way around. According to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who was present, Putin explained what Ukraine was, at least a third of the population ethnic Russians, and the negative consequences that could arise, not only for Russia, but for all of Europe, if Ukraine and Georgia were dragged into NATO. American Ambassador Bill Burns, who was with Rice at the meeting, stated that Rice responded by declaring that each sovereign nation had the right to decide for itself which institutions or alliances it wanted to join. Putin reportedly replied, "You don't understand what you're doing. You're playing with fire." In February of 2008, Ambassador Burns sent a classified cable back to Washington, summing up another meeting with Foreign Minister Lavrov about Ukraine's intent to seek a NATO membership action plan. As niet means niet, Russia's NATO enlargement red lines. The Russians had reiterated again that Ukraine in NATO was unacceptable, citing among other concerns that the issue could precipitate division in the country, perhaps leading to civil war, which would put Russia in the difficult position of having to choose whether to intervene or not, a decision it was stressed that Russia did not want to be faced with. In the midst of this NATO expansion, the Bush II administration also decided to unilaterally pull out of the ABM Treaty in 2002, which was seen as potentially jeopardizing the nuclear balance of power by leaving the US and NATO free to pursue a first strike capability with implementation of an anti-ballistic missile shield. In the same vein, US and NATO missiles have been placed in Romania and Poland in recent years under the guise of a missile defense system, but it is believed by Russia to have offensive capabilities that further undermine its nuclear defense. The Russian leadership has proposed more than once to negotiate a mutually agreeable solution to these problems. Most notably, in 2008, Putin ordered the Russian Foreign Ministry to draft a proposal that Dmitry Medvedev took to Brussels, outlining a security plan that would cover all of the Euro-Atlantic community and Russia, obviating the need for NATO's continued existence, much less its expansion. That, along with other proposals, had been rejected or ignored by December of 2021. And that concludes my portion of the presentation.
Managed to unmute myself here with PowerPoint still on. Thank you, Natalie. And everybody, as you can gather, there is a long history to this, as Natalie's taken us through some of. So here's a list of the things that I'm going to discuss. And as I mentioned before, I'm just a web developer. I'm not a researcher or a writer. But since I was old enough to understand the risk, I've been concerned about the possibility of a nuclear catastrophe. And like some of you, I'm sure, I was active in the anti-nuclear movement and citizen diplomacy activities of the 1980s. Then starting with the Gorbachev era, the nuclear threat faded into the background. And as a new parent, I focused on other things. But then came the Ukrainian government overthrow of 2014, which I'm going to discuss in some detail. leading to the rapid collapse of US-Russia relations, at which point I became very concerned again. I looked for a way I could do something useful, and ultimately I found and became a volunteer for a group called the Center for Citizen Initiatives, an organization that has a long history of sponsoring citizen diplomacy initiatives, first between the US and the Soviet Union, and then between the US and Russia. And in 2016, that led to my wife and I being able to go on a mind-blowing trip to Crimea and several Russian cities with a small CCI group, where I had the chance to see what was going on for myself. I think that much of what I learned in Crimea has become particularly relevant now. So I'd like to take you back to that trip. Here's the group we traveled with, along with some friends we'd made in Crimea. I've always referred to the group as a bunch of amazing peace activists, and then my wife, Karen, and myself. These were people like Ray McGovern, Ann Wright, Kathy Kelly, David Hartsaw, people I'd always admired from a distance, but never expected to meet in person, much less be able to call friends. It was a small group. I think there were 17 of us in total. Here are the places we traveled: Moscow, various cities in Crimea, the Krasnodar region of Russia, and then on to St. Petersburg. I'm going to focus on the Crimea portion of the trip since it's most relevant to what's happening now. But everywhere we met people who were concerned about the deteriorations of Russian relations between Russia and the West, and very much wanted peace. Here's a little background as to what was happening at the time. This is actually from a presentation I gave right after we came back. And if you look at this list of incidents and things that were happening, and basically many of which related to the NATO expansion towards Russia, it looks awfully similar to what we've seen, in, at least until the last couple of days, but that we've been seeing recently. You know, they talk about how history isn't necessarily the same, but it often rhymes. And notice that we're talking about military action along Russia's borders, not the other way around. How would we react to troops and nuclear missiles being placed along the Mexico and Canada borders? Here's Crimea. I believe we were the first significant American group to actually visit there since Russia annexed it in the spring of 2014. And here's a map. To the north is Ukraine. To the east is the Russian Krasnodar region. When we visited in 2016, thanks to Ukraine blocking the border, the only way in was by air or by sea. There's now a bridge to the Krasnodar region. Crimea, had, as Natalie explained, had been part of Russia for a long time. You could say going back to the days of Catherine the Great. In 1954, Khrushchev moved it to Ukraine as a favor to the government there. Of course, since it was still part of the Soviet Union, that didn't have the weight that such a move would have today. Here's what the Washington Post said back then. And you can read this. The occupation of Crimea was preceded by a fraudulent referendum and an invitation from a pro-Russian regional government installed by force and fraud. Russia's occupation has already led to serious human rights violations, including numerous restrictions of freedom of speech and press and persecution of the Crimean Tatai minority. And today, even, Crimea remains on the State Department list of dangerous places Americans shouldn't travel. Some of the text from the current State Department advisory reads, occupation authorities continue to abuse and arbitrarily imprison foreigners and the local population. And as you're probably gathering, one of the themes of this presentation is that you can't always believe the official story, whether it's coming from the government, the mainstream media, whether it's here, whether it's Russia, whether it's Ukraine or somewhere else. Here's the Crimea that we actually saw. The people that we met were very warm, relaxed, and very happy to be part of Russia. And I'll shortly explain some of the reasons why. And that colorful character who is leading the kids dancing is actually somebody from Finding Dory, if anybody remembers that movie. Crimea is an incredibly beautiful place. And a lot of people come there for vacation. It used to be people from all over the world, But now that the US and Europe have put sanctions on it, cruise ships don't arrive there anymore. So it's mostly just Russians. We saw a lot of kids coming there for summer camp. We saw a lot of crazy scenes in the street that you'd run into. With the current US sanctions, Starbucks wouldn't be able to set up a store there, but that didn't stop Starducks. And about sanctions, by the way, it's interesting how they don't always fit the narrative. The official story here was that the people of Crimea were suffering under Russian occupation. Yet the first thing the US did was to impose sanctions directly on those people that we were saying were the victims. Like the US has now done with Donbass and previously Cuba, it's illegal for anyone to spend US dollars in or for Crimea, even for humanitarian purposes. We had meetings with all kinds of groups. This one, oh boy, this particular venue had met with veterans, city council members, local youth groups, educators, students. And at a larger meeting here, representatives from different NGOs, the mayor, regional government officials, the local Rotary Club, reps from different ethnic communities, including Bulgarians, Jews, Germans, Armenians, Tatars, and Greeks. There was an ongoing effort to support all ethnic communities in Crimea at that point. I believe that's continued. We also had lots of informal discussions here, and because of time, I'm not going to play the video, but Tanya Bukarina is telling us about how they lived with the power cutoff after Ukraine destroyed the power station, and now continue to live with how they continue to live with US and European sanctions. We often heard some fairly strong points of view.
Это закрытое море, и натовским здесь кораблям не место.
We are against NATO, any NATO ships in the Black Sea. Crimea is a small area, and when we do not need any NATO presence near our shores. And our slogan for 23 years was NATO go home. We know a lot about NATO exercises in the Black Sea because always we followed those exercises, and always we refused to accept the idea of such joint exercise.
There were lighter moments too. This was an aspiring Crimean high school singer, and if we had time, I'd love to play the beautiful English that he sang for us. But we happened to be there at the time of the World War II memorial ceremony at Levadia Palace. And this is a ceremony honoring World War II veterans and those who've been lost. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people in World War II, and Crimeans, like other Russians, are still very much living with that war. I think this is one of the reasons the Russians are so sensitive to the neo-Nazi elements that exist in Western Ukraine, and I'll refer to that more soon. Ray McGovern from our group addressed the veterans and was a big hit. He speaks Russian fluently. Ray was a CIA analyst from 1963 to 1990, and in the 1980s chaired the National Intelligence Estimate and prepared the President's Daily Brief. He's now a major peace activist. So I want to go through some events in the timeline for Crimea. And I'm going to expand this timeline as we go. We start with a couple of dates. March 16th, 2014 is the Crimean referendum. 2 days later, the Russian annexation of Crimea. So key questions. Why did Russia decide to annex, quote unquote, Crimea? And why did 96% of the Russians who voted in the referendum choose to join Russia? So as far as why Russia annexed it, I'm not going to attempt to justify the move, but I am going to try and give you a better idea of some of the factors that contributed to it. And I should also add just the validity of that rather mind-blowing 96% yes vote has been verified by multiple independent sources and polling organizations. And it jives with what I learned from many people I spoke with about it there. So let's add another element to the timeline, trying to explain what led to the decisions. February 20th to 22nd, this is when as we called it, popular uprising overthrew the elected government of Ukraine. The Ukraine Euromaidan demonstrations in Kiev began in November 2013 after the Ukrainian government paused preparations to sign a Ukraine-European Union Association Agreement. The government had concerns about the impacts that the agreement's austerity requirements would have had, as well as its agreement to cut economic ties to Russia. The demonstration started peacefully, but then escalated into increasing levels of violence, finally horrific violence. Let's add another event to our timeline, the intercepted phone conversation on February 4th. Now, note that this is a couple of weeks before the popular uprising takes place. I'm going to play just a short excerpt from that, and then I'll explain what it is that you're hearing.
What do you think?
I think we're in play. The Klitschko piece is obviously the complicated electron here, especially the announcement of him as deputy prime minister. And you've seen some of my notes on the troubles in the marriage right now. So we're trying to get a read really fast on where he is on this stuff.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, you know, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week. Sullivan's come back to me, VFR, saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deets to stick. So okay. Biden's willing.
So the female voice you just heard is Victoria Nuland, Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. The male was Jeffrey Pyatt, our ambassador to Ukraine. I played you 3 short excerpts. Still not known exactly who intercepted this, although the Russians are a good bet. The first excerpt referred to Yats, who's Arseny Yatsenyuk, who then became the new prime minister when the people put him in place 2 weeks later. He was chosen over 2 other potential candidates that were considered less controllable. And the Biden reference is the Biden you're thinking of. He was put in charge of the quote unquote Ukrainian project by President Obama. Shortly after the new government was put in place, Hunter Biden, Joe's youngest son, was appointed to the board of directors of Ukraine's largest private gas producer. The full conversation is out there on YouTube for anybody to listen to. The US government has complained about the fact that it was leaked, but has never challenged its authenticity. And so this was only a short excerpt, but combined with other evidence that subsequently surfaced, it's clear that there was a heavy influence both by US government planners who were working with far-right neo-Nazi groups that subsequently have gained significant power in Ukraine, and we'll look more at them. So why did Russia decide to annex Crimea, and why did 96% of the Crimeans who voted choose to join Russia? Well, to answer the question of why the annexation, you have to realize that Crimea includes the Sevastopol naval base that supports Russia's Black Sea Fleet. When the Soviet Union dissolved, it was agreed that even though Crimea was otherwise Ukrainian territory, Russia would be allowed to keep the base. And that's no small affair. Walking around the city of Sevastopol, it's clear that everything revolves around that base. It's one of Russia's most important military facilities. And after the Maidan government overthrow, Russia faced the possibility of US and NATO coming in and attempting to take charge. Even in 2014, with a Russia less powerful and restive than it is now, that was an impossible thing to accept. And so as far as why did 96% of the Crimeans choose to join Russia? Well, to partly answer that question, you need to know about the buses, which we'll add to our timeline here. So, sorry, I've got a, the Crimeans were very much against the Maidan protest. And 8 buses from all over Crimea were sent to Kiev to counter protest. And they got out with their signs and banners and quickly found themselves threatened by angry mobs. They got scared, they got back in their buses to return to Crimea. And on the return, the buses made it as far as the town of Korsun. And that's this next video that I was displaying here. There, the buses were stopped by a right-wing mob. The Crimeans were dragged off them and the buses were burned. The Crimeans were beaten and tortured. These videos were taken on cell phones by people who were there at the time. I talked with one of the survivors who made it back to Crimea. I won't describe what was done to him, but it was unspeakable. Today, he's permanently injured, but very happy to be alive. In the end, 7 people were killed and many more ended up badly injured. I'm going to stop the video here. I think we've seen enough. Everyone in Crimea has a friend, family member, or associate who was on one of those buses. So Russia was saving its military base, but in taking back Crimea, it also saved the Crimean people from the violence they feared they would experience once the right-wing elements from Kiev reached Crimea. And that's part of the reason that they voted 96%. You may have seen this photo in the announcement for the meeting. This statue had been built in the Crimean capital of Simferopol shortly before our trip. Here's what it's about. After the Ukrainian government overthrow, there was a great deal of anger directed towards Crimeans. They faced both real and threatened attacks coming from Western Ukraine. In the weeks before the referendum and annexation, soldiers and sailors from the Sevastopol naval base fanned out throughout Crimea in uniforms that didn't contain any insignias. They stood at various points to keep the peace and were very much loved by the Crimeans for this. And that's what the statue depicts. In the West, we've heard that these soldiers were part of an invasion coming in from Russia and were there to impose Russia's will on the people. Based on all the conversations that I had with people, nothing could be further from the truth. The Tatars are very long-term residents of Crimea. They were evicted by Stalin and under Khrushchev began returning and now have returned significantly. Our Western media and experts commonly tell us the Tatars suffered persecution once Crimea became part of Russia. That may have happened initially, but at the point we were there, that's not what we saw. And here was a representative from the local Tatar community inviting us to come visit their museum.
I'm a Crimean Tatar, and like
this is the translation he had just spoken.
Crimean Tatars, I did participate in Crimean Spring events, and it was my will that Sevastopol and Crimea becomes again part of Russia.
Пользуясь случаем,
I've cut his speech there.
On behalf of the Crimean Tatars, I invite you, members of your Senate, your president, to visit Crimea, to visit the homes of Crimean Tatars in order to see with your own eyes how we see, what we think. So welcome.
And our president and Senate may not have visited, but our little group did. And we learned a great deal there. And this is our group along with some of the Tatars that we met there who we had conversations with. There were, I'll finish up the excerpts with just a few human moments that we had. This was a Russian, Crimean, American swim for peace. There were many wonderful relations we had with people. And a birthday party.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Luba. Happy birthday to you.
Hooray! You know, there were many more human moments from that trip that I'd originally planned to present. But with what's happening now, this just doesn't seem like the right time to show them. So I'm going to move on from Crimea, and what happened to Ukraine since the Maidan revolution that we looked at. We'll start with a scene that took place about a year later. And this is with, if you remember, Victoria Nuland's chosen prime minister to be, Arseniy Yatsenyuk. And a year later, he was giving a speech in parliament.
Не для власного політичного рейтингу, а для того, щоб провести реформи і рейтинг був нашої країни. Ви маєте повні конституційні...
So this is a little dark humor there, but by the end of 2015, Ukraine had effectively descended into a degree of civil war and economic collapse. And Ukraine has really never recovered. Its economic situation and political situation has remained in a good deal of chaos. So quickly looking at Ukrainian presidential succession, we had Petro Poroshenko from 2014 to 2019. And he was an extremely rich oligarch. Level of his corruption was revealed in the Panama Papers that have come out. His policies were mostly pro-Western and anti-Eastern, and his popularity waned as Ukraine deteriorated. Vladimir Zelensky was elected in 2019. He's an actor, comedian turned politician. There was a great deal of hope at the beginning of his tenure because in part he ran on ending the so-called frozen conflict in the East, which we'll talk more about. But he then turned around and pursued mostly anti-Eastern policies. And Western Ukrainian neo-Nazi groups made it very clear, quite publicly, he must not make peace with Eastern Ukraine if he valued his life. And that gets us to the rise of the far right in Ukraine. There's always been a far right neo-Nazi element in Western Ukraine, at least in recent time. But since Maidan, its power has grown heavily. So as now departed professor and historian Stephen Cohen points out, not even many Americans who follow international news know, and then I'm going to continue with his quote, first, that the Azov battalion of some 3,000 well-armed fighters, which has played a major combat role in the Ukrainian civil war and is now an official component of Kiev's armed forces, is avowedly partially pro-Nazi, as evidenced by its regalia, slogans, and programmatic statements. Cohen goes on to state that the pogrom-like burning to death of ethnic Russians and others in Odessa shortly later in 2014 reawakened memories of Nazi extermination squads in Ukraine during World War II. But this has been all but deleted from American mainstay narrative, even though it remains a painful and revelatory experience for many Ukrainians. And Cohen goes on that stormtroop-like assaults on gays, Jews, elderly ethnic Russians, and other impure citizens are widespread throughout Kiev-ruled Ukraine, along with torchlight marches reminiscent of those that eventually inflamed Germany in the late 1920s and 30s. And I should add this, as you can see, this particular march was beginning of this year to honor Stefan Bandera, who Natalie talked about. Here's a new image of Stefan Bandera on one of the state regional council buildings. The neo-Nazi element now enjoys significant support among portions of the Ukrainian police and government. The Donbas republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, which now are so very much in our news, formed shortly after the Maidan government overthrow. As documented by Natalie, after the Maidan overthrow, the anti-Russian far right gained significant power within the new government. Laws were introduced seeking to delegitimize the Russian language. Neo-Nazis were given posts in the interior and education departments, and many acts of violence were committed against members of the Communist Party and the Party of Regions, which was the overthrown president's party. These were threatening developments for the primarily Russian populations in the East. Like the people of Crimea, they wanted protection. Unlike Crimea, however, they didn't have the advantage of a major Russian military base on their territory that Russia couldn't afford to lose. In May 2014, the Donetsk and Luhansk districts held referendums proposing self-rule, and both referendums overwhelmingly passed. Almost immediately, both self-declared republics found themselves at war with Western Ukraine. The biggest military conflict until now was from March 2014 to February 2015. Then, until yesterday, it became referred to as a frozen conflict. Frozen means periodic shelling and occasional deaths. Aaron Mate points out that of the 14,000 deaths in Donbass prior to now, 81% were in rebel territory. Gives you an idea where the major violence was coming from and to. The Minsk II agreement, Minsk II was the greatest hope for a settlement of the Donbass conflict, and it was developed at a summit between all of the powers involved. And it would have provided limited autonomy to the Donbass, Donetsk and Luhansk districts. And however, it was almost immediately rendered unworkable by what has been referred to as a poison pill. And that poison pill was after the agreement was agreed to, and then Poroshenko went back to the capital, a new demand was made that the Donetsk and Luhansk regions would be required to effectively surrender and turn over all final decisions to the Western Ukrainian authorities. And that gets at the fact that since the Maidan government overthrow, there have always been questions as to who's running the show. I suspect Poroshenko really did want this to work, but then far-right elements had their say and scuttled it. The agreement's been continuously referenced by both sides, but the Ukrainian government never again has taken it seriously. And with the events of the last couple of days, of course, it's now probably academic. Another key element since then has been what I call the poisoning of US public opinion. During and after our 2016 trip, WikiLeaks released a trove of leaked DNC emails that showed how the DNC had conspired to keep Bernie Sanders from winning the nomination. The DNC attempted successfully, I'd say, to shift public attention away from the content of these emails and toward a claim that they'd been hacked by Russia. And thus began the episode many people refer to as Russiagate. There isn't time to get into the details here, but as a technical person and web developer who's looked into this, I'm personally quite comfortable that Russia had nothing to do with the hacking of those emails. Once it became clear there were significant reasons to doubt that allegation, the focus of Russiagate then switched. And what it switched to really was some silly social media posts made by Russian organizations alleged and quite possibly connected with the Russian government. But this was in Facebook, Twitter. They were a teeny percentage of thousands of continual social media posts. As you know, social media by then was full of crap, as it is now, as well as valid things. And claiming that this was somehow Russian control of the US elections is, to me, it really takes a stretch. Russiagate evolved, in my opinion, into the Democratic explanation of why Hillary lost the 2016 election. It wasn't that the Democrats had selected a seriously flawed candidate, it was Russian interference. This was particularly convenient for the neoconservatives, as it helped generate a general hatred of Russia that was convenient for the neocon agenda. It was also convenient for the Mickey Mat. Ray McGovern came up with this update on the old military industrial complex. Mickey Mat stands for the Military Industrial Counterintelligence Media Academia Think Tank Complex. You can now find it in the various alternate dictionaries online. And I think it's safe to say the Mickey Mat now has a substantial role in controlling US foreign policy. There are going to be lots of new sanctions on Russia now, but since 2014, the US has imposed multiple waves of sanctions already. They've hurt, but they've also had the unintended effect of forcing Russia to move away from just being an energy provider and become self-sufficient in many areas, including agriculture. In fact, primarily agriculture. I took this photo inside one of the massive series of greenhouses now in Krasnodar, where they produce cucumbers. Russia now produces most of its own food and has become a large agricultural exporter. The original war and then the so-called frozen conflict in Donbass has its toll. This photo is from the Alley of Angels in Donetsk. It's for all the children who've been killed. By the entrance, there's an arch made of forged roses interwoven with a machine gun, ammunition casings, a symbol of war, and doves, a symbol of peace. Under the arch, there's a granite slab with the names and ages of the children. I'm afraid it looks like that toll is about to get much worse. So we get to now. And here we get to the questions for the last few days. Why did Russia do it? What's going to happen with this war? There's a new round of sanctions. What are they going to do? Crimea versus Donbass. I'm going to just speak very briefly to this because there are plenty of people with a lot more knowledge than me talking about it in every venue. The question is why Russia? Why did Russia do it? The standard line in Western media is that Russia's trying to just regain territory and form a new Soviet Union. I don't buy that. If you listen to what Russians have been saying consistently for many years now, it's that they want their need for safety respected and they want to be an equal player in a multipolar world, not one dominated by a single indispensable, as Obama called us, nation. Even though most people, including myself, didn't believe it, that this was going to happen, Russia's been warning us that this was coming for a long time now if we didn't at least meet them halfway. They see their country at risk from NATO, and they see fellow Russians at risk from the elements in Western Ukraine. They finally concluded that the West was never going to negotiate seriously with them. And they came to believe that military option was the only option to achieve their objectives. And again, this is my interpretation of what the Russian leadership decided. This is not a statement on my part that it was the right thing to do. I'm just trying to explain where I believe they're coming from. What's going to happen with this war? I don't know. I'm particularly concerned by the statements that have been made that Russia intends to look for significant neo-Nazis and bring them to trial. That seems to imply far more than just removing Ukraine's military capabilities. And I cringe to think of what the results might be if Russia really pursues that. One anecdote that might have some relevance here. On that 2016 trip, while we were in St. Petersburg, we spoke with some college students, and one of them was busily trying to keep a student visa. So as he put it, he wouldn't be sent home to Ukraine and then forced to join the military and kill Russians. My impression is that the Ukrainian military consists of mostly of three groups. There are some mercenaries Then there are the far right groups that see themselves as fighting a noble battle. Finally, and I think this is the biggest group, there are all the regular Ukrainians who, just like the student we met in St. Petersburg, are only in the military because they have to be. That leads me to believe the Ukrainian military may not be all that effective in fighting the Russians and their allied Eastern Ukrainians. I've already mentioned the unexpected impact of sanctions and how they've allowed Russia to develop more self-sufficiency. How that will stand up in the new round of sanctions, I'm not sure. And I think there's some obvious similarities and differences between Crimea and Donbass, and I've mentioned some of those. So I think I'm going to move on here, but I'll happily take questions about that. We're getting close to the end of the presentation here, but there's something that I think is really, really important. While we were in Crimea in 2016, by coincidence, the St. Petersburg Economic Forum was taking place. One thing this provided was a rare opportunity for President Putin to speak directly to Western journalists. The clip that follows is a small excerpt from his comment to them. Looking at it now, I think it's a pretty haunting prediction of the future. There's a discussion we don't have time for here about who is the real Putin. In a nutshell, I believe the real Putin has both good and bad qualities, but he has little relationship to the comic book villain that we see in our media. In this clip, Putin conveys his frustrations that not only does the West refuse to take Russia's security interests into account, but Western media won't even allow them to be discussed. He explains that as Russia's president, he has to work to protect those interests. And he expresses his fears about where all this is heading.
Теперь по поводу ПРО. Послушайте, вот здесь все очень взрослые люди и уже опытные. Мы с вами, я сейчас не буду просить, чтобы вы это все, вот так, как я скажу, отражали в своих материалах, влияли на прессу там, или как. Я просто вам, вот знаете, хочу вам лично сказать, напомнить какие-то вещи. Ведь мир избавлен от крупномасштабных войн и военных конфликтов. Мы с вами все об этом знаем. Благодаря так называемому стратегическому балансу, который был достигнут после того, как угрозы нет, а система ПРО продолжает строиться. Значит, мы были правы, когда говорили, что нас обманывают. С нами неискренне. Но я знаю точно, что мы вынуждены будем отвечать. Только я уже заранее знаю, чтобы нас будут обвинять в агрессивном, опять в агрессивном поведении, хотя это только ответ. Но ясно, что мы должны будем обеспечить безопасность, не только свою. Но нам очень важно обеспечить стратегический баланс в мире. И еще раз вернусь к этому и закончу ответ на этот вопрос с того, с чего начал. Вот именно этот стратегический баланс обеспечил, гарантировал мир на планете, гарантировал нас от крупных вооруженных конфликтов за последние 70 лет. И это благо, хоть оно такое, знаете, основанное как бы на взаимной угрозе, но тем не менее взаимная угроза, она обеспечила нам глобальный мир на протяжении десятилетий. Как его можно разрушить, так я не знаю. Мне кажется, что это очень опасно. Не только кажется, я в этом уверен.
And that brings me back to the beginning of my talk and why I became involved with the Russia and Ukraine issues in the first place. Whatever you believe about Putin, whatever you believe about Russia, whatever you believe about who is right and who is wrong, none of it is going to matter if we let this happen. Here are some ways you can get active about this if you're not already. Some organizations that are doing some really, really good work. And got a bunch of alternate information sources outside of our mainstream media, and we'll make this available to everybody after the presentation. And I want to give a big time thanks here to Larissa Haig, who is what I'm calling our Ukrainian boots on the ground and research partner. Larissa is able to keep up with the media there and is in touch with people there. And knows what's happening in ways that we can't possibly know here through the limited lens with which we can review all of this. Here is our contact information. Again, I'll make this available afterwards. We're going to have a Q&A section here, but you're welcome to contact any of us afterwards by email as well. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing here. And turn it back to you, Tom.
All right, thank you. And thank you, Natalie. That's a lot, and a lot of things I think that people are not familiar with. So very pleased you were able to come tonight. What we thought we would do is solicit questions from you in chat for two reasons. One, if there are a bunch of people with the same question, we'll just pick one person for it. And second, if you've got a question, indicate, if you would, just very simply whether you would like to ask it yourself or whether I should just convey it. While folks have a moment to put some things in chat, Shirley has suggested that I ask David Hartso, who was on the trip with Bob, as he has mentioned, and is in the group tonight, if he would like to add anything to this.
Not a whole lot, but I really appreciate Bob's presentation and Natalie. And I think it's, one thing I guess I would add, and I was certainly as deeply touched and moved by our conversations and all the people we met with in Russia and in Crimea. But there are really quite significant demonstrations in Russia now against, speaking against the invasion of Ukraine or the attack on Ukraine. And there are also in Crimea, in Ukraine, and there are and will be in the United States. And I think we need to support each other. I mean, war obviously is not the answer. Nobody's going to win this war. War is only going to create massive suffering and death, and could be, as I think Bob mentioned, if it ends up with nuclear war, it could be the end of all of us. So I guess I just feel we, the people of the United States, of Russia, of Ukraine, of the whole world, need to rise up and say no to this war. And the only real way to resolve this is through negotiation. And I think, to me, and I think this was also said before, but if the United States and Ukraine and NATO had simply said, NATO is not going to, or Ukraine is not going to join NATO, I think we could have avoided this whole thing. And so while it looks like Russia is the terrible aggressor here, and it is, the United States and NATO need to take a very significant responsibility for not being willing to go halfway and say, and put ourselves in the Russian shoes. I mean, I think, as was said, if Russia or China had military bases and thousands of troops on our borders, we saw during the Cuba Missile Crisis, we were willing to bring the whole world to the brink of nuclear war to say no. Soviet Union, you cannot do that. And it's just too bad that we weren't willing to, from the beginning, be willing to have true negotiations, not just adamant NATO is going to do whatever it wants to, and the U.S. is going to do whatever it wants to with military bases and troops and missiles, etc. So thank you, Bob, and Natalie for doing this.
All right. Thank you.
And
Okay.
thanks, David. So well said.
So no one is indicating a particular special interest in speaking the question themselves. So I'll just go through what we've got here.
I am though.
This is who?
Jeffrey Barkdale.
Okay, Jeffrey, ask your question.
I'm glad you showed me all this, because if I became president not knowing this, I would have been just as ignorant on the whole thing as everyone else is now. It's more of a thank you than a question. I want to thank you for the, and here's the biggest question of all. I left it in the comments. Can all this be fixed, without the use of time travel?
Well, Jeffrey has posed all the fundamental questions we all ask and wish there were ready answers to. Stephanie asks, what about these oligarchs? What is all that about? We always hear about the sanctions on the oligarchs. Any wisdom on that, the meaning of and impact of that?
Well, I'm not speaking from a tremendous amount of knowledge here, but a general impression is that both Russia, the Ukraine, and the US all have their oligarchs. All three countries at this point have some vast differences in wealth, and a small percentage at the top who are extremely wealthy and have unusual amounts of power. And I believe that the reference here was referring to Russian oligarchs, and that we are going to cut support to them, and that will help put pressure on Russia. If I've interpreted the question correctly, whether that's true, I don't really know. It's unfortunate that all three countries have their oligarchs, to be honest. But it is the way it is right now, and the people in general, the power tends to go with wealth.
So if the oligarchs were removed, can this whole thing be situated, if you know what I mean? This whole
I don't know the answer to that question. I just don't, as in particular, I don't know enough about the influence at this point in the Russian leadership and the Ukrainian leadership. I do know that what I can say is that under Putin, the influence of Russian oligarchs has decreased from what it was, say, around the year 2000. And that some of the corruption that was being experienced then, the corruption level is less, but it's not gone.
I would add
Let
that.
me, hold on, folks. If you want to indicate in chat that you'd like to ask a question out loud, I'll try and get to you. We got two people asking similar question. Who else do you think there's anyone out there who can, apart from Ukraine, us, who are an ocean away, but apart from Ukraine and Russia, European diplomats, etc. Is it your sense that there's anybody outside of the immediate conflict that can do anything useful, or do you think they will, etc.?
I think the Europeans could, but it would really depend on the European powers like France and Germany's willingness to step out from under the shadow of Washington and act independently, because it's in Europe's interests to not be at loggerheads with Russia. They share the same continent. It makes sense for them to have certain economic relationships with each other. Russia and China are working together with the Eurasian Economic Union and the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's in Europe's interests in the long term to work cooperatively with that economic project. But I'm skeptical that European powers at this point feel confident enough, or however you want to say it, to act independently of Washington. But I think that's what it would take for Europe to take the initiative and maybe play a constructive role in resolving this.
Okay, thank you. There is a question here, which I think is very much to the point of what we Americans know, think, believe to be real. I will read it. You may have seen this from Stephanie Krugel. Some news outlets suggest that not responding forcefully to the invasion of Ukraine will result in Russia continuing on to other Eastern European countries, for example, Poland, Lithuania, etc. True? I think this is a very important question in terms of the way America perceives Russia. Either or both of you care to comment on that? The domino theory,
Yeah,
revisited.
well, a first thought about that is, first of all, as a practical matter, if Russia were to do anything with those countries which are part of NATO already, the other NATO countries would be forced to respond under the NATO Charter, and we would immediately be on the footsteps of World War III, if not there already. And I think Russia knows this. I don't think Russia is suicidal. I think one of the reasons that Russia is so concerned about Ukraine is that it doesn't want to be in the same situation facing Ukraine that it is with those countries. But a second point is, apart from the not wanting to commit suicide issue, I don't think that's where Russia is coming from here. If you follow the last numerous years in Russia's existence, Russia's interests are in being taken as an equal member of, as it calls it, members of a multipolar world, and of being safe and allowed to pursue its domestic priorities. And there's been relatively little indication that I've seen that Russia has expansionist desires. Ukraine is a special case because of the issues that have gone on for a long time, and especially starting in 2014. I don't think we see much evidence that Russia has other interests. And then again, as a practical matter, who else are we talking about? There are other Eastern European countries that are friendly with Russia. It's certainly shown no interest in subsuming them into becoming part of a new Soviet Union. And then there are the cases, the specific cases of Ukraine and Georgia. There was an issue with Georgia a while back that is in the West was portrayed as a Russian attempt to invade. If you look at the details, actually, it was I think a much different situation. It was a Russian response to something that had happened there. But Russia certainly, if Russia had chosen to, it could have then gone much further with military invasion in Georgia. It certainly didn't. Ukraine, I don't know what's going to happen now. This is surprising me. I wouldn't have expected that Russia would go this far, but I do think that Ukraine is a special case, and I don't think it's indicative of a Russia that is trying to march into one country after another.
Natalie, anything to add to that?
I agree with Bob. This is about Ukraine and NATO, which as in part of my presentation, I documented that for years and years, Russia has been saying, this is a red line. You've expanded and you've expanded. Okay, this is a red line. And they've been repeating this over and over for years since 2007, 2006. And they just haven't been listened to. And so I don't see any reason, why they would want to take over the Baltic countries or anything like that. They don't need more territory. They would be spending a ridiculous amount of money, blood and treasure in trying to occupy countries that would be hostile to their presence. So yeah, I think that Ukraine is a special situation. I don't see any evidence that Russia would be interested in going any further than that.
Okay. A couple of people have raised, expressed an interest, raised a question that is, I wouldn't say a mirror image, but the question of the involvement of Nazi elements, neo-Nazi elements. And I think if I can, editorialize on the question, I think people wonder, is that overstated by people who are opposed to Washington's general foreign policy? Did you say anything more about your sense of the meaning and the level of neo-Nazi involvement in Ukrainian politics and government?
Well, the neo-Nazi element is certainly a great propaganda point for Russia, but it's not a made-up propaganda point. In terms of their numbers, they do have an outsized influence in terms of their numbers, but it's because of their willingness to use violence. They've demonstrated over the years since 2014, whenever they think that the Kyiv government is going to do anything that they perceive to be a concession to the Donbass or to Russia, they have acted violently outside of government buildings. They've made threats. It's because of their willingness to use violence to effectively block what they perceive to be any kind of concession to Russia. So that's why they have the kind of influence they do. It's not because they have huge numbers. It's because of the violence that they're willing to use.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions here that I kind of suspect that you're not in a position to know anything about, but I could be wrong. The danger of nuclear power plants. Somebody says that CBS, on CBS, someone said the Russians will remove the containment structures, which the person who raised it thought was absurd. So I'm not talking about that, but the danger of nuclear reactors being affected in war and so forth. And I don't know if either of you feel any position or have any desire to comment on that question.
Well, no special expertise. Obviously, it's a very scary prospect. The one thing I do know, at least according to the latest reports, one thing that Russia has done is their troops have taken over the Chernobyl plant area, which of course isn't a currently functioning plant, but is entombed at this point. An attack on that area would cause a massive release of radiation that would be catastrophic. And so I presume that there's a military strategic reason for doing this, is that they can use it as a staging point. And the Ukrainians know that if they attack the Russians there, they run the risk of blowing the containment and causing a humanitarian catastrophe across Ukraine. Very scary prospect.
Could I just say a word, Tom? There are 15, in addition to Chernobyl, there's 15 nuclear reactors nuclear plants in Ukraine. And if in all the fighting that may be going on between the Russian soldiers and the Ukrainians and all the military, heavy-duty military equipment that's there on both sides, whether by design or by accident, if just one of those nuclear plants is bombed or attacked, all of Europe is going to suffer. Everybody all over Europe suffered from the Chernobyl disaster back in '86, I guess it was. But that could be small potatoes compared to if any of these nuclear reactors gets by accident or on purpose is attacked. It's going to be horrible for all of Europe. So it's critical for more reasons than one that all this madness be stopped now, not after this happens.
Yeah, that is a really good and scary point, David.
The point I think actually that probably could be made about warfare, the danger of warfare in any society with such plants. Yeah. Not necessarily particular to this one. There was a question raised about whether, I'll read it. Is it at all conceivable that Ukraine could be split with the pro-Russian regions in Crimea going to Russia and maybe the rest joining the EU as their own country? Is that what in fact is essentially happening, or?
You know, I've read some speculation that doesn't go quite that far, that talks about the, well, that actually does go that far, that talks about the country being effectively split into two. I've read the speculation. At this point, I have no idea how realistic a possibility that would be. Natalie, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it depends on what Russia does. If at some point they end their attacks on the military infrastructure in the rest of Ukraine and have their military just back at the Donbass, there's a possibility that Donbass could just end up becoming, an independent country or part of Russia eventually. And then what's left of Ukraine would just be Ukraine.
One thing that scares me a lot, still getting back to that could influence that, is the statements Russia has made about making the neo-Nazi leaders pay and putting them on trial. That would seem to imply a Russian occupation that, at least in the short run, wouldn't make that possible. I just hope to God that that's bravado and they don't really intend to follow through with that.
The only thing I can think of about enforcing that is, I know that earlier today, our time, because Ukraine and Russia are 10 hours ahead of us. I read that in the news that Moscow had offered surrender terms to Zelensky, and the two main terms that were publicly made public, was neutrality in terms of Ukraine and promising not to use offensive weapons in Ukraine. Now, there could be other terms that are not public. Non-public terms could include, he has to agree to turn over certain named people who are believed to be leaders of neo-Nazi groups that would be turned over to Russia. So it could be part of maybe some terms of a surrender that would, aren't public yet. But as far as I know, Zelensky has not agreed to that anyway, so.
Okay. Suzanne Cowan asks, does oil play a role in this in any way?
I think natural gas might play somewhat of a role more than oil. Europe is pretty dependent on Russia for natural gas, and it makes sense for them to use Russia's natural gas. It's cheaper, it's more efficient to get to them rather than the US's natural gas being shipped over to them. I think that's, for the United States, I think that's one factor driving this. I don't think that's the main factor or the whole factor. I mean, it could be part of like a larger factor of the US trying to keep Europe in its orbit and keep economic and political control over Europe. Whereas, like I said earlier, it makes sense moving forward for Europe to, take advantage of the Eurasian economic projects.
Okay, excuse me, my assistant is asserting his presence. My read on the comments is, or on the chat, is that the rest of what we have is essentially comments, that there are no additional questions that haven't been put. If I'm wrong on that, somebody say that in chat right away. Okay. There are people who wished, obviously, to give their own questions because they ain't telling us what they are. Robin Krupp.
So can I speak? Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So thank you, everyone. This is very enlightening tonight. I'm learning a lot. And I want to ask, someone said that there might be a lot of bioweapons labs in these areas, and if they're attacked, it would release bioweapons into the world. And I wanted to know if anyone has any knowledge about that.
I've heard of that. I don't have any knowledge about if there would be any plans to intentionally attack those places, and I don't know how many places there are like that. So I don't have any details about it, unfortunately.
It wouldn't have to be intentional. That could be accidental as well.
Absolutely. And I've read claims to that effect too, but unfortunately I suspect there is some truth to that. And that's obviously a very frightening possibility, just like the nuclear release.
Just like nuclear, yeah.
Donald Smith has a question.
Yeah, I mentioned it, but I've made it as a statement, and that is a somewhat scary thing related to this Ukraine crisis is that that Trump and some of his supporters are saying the U.S. should not get involved in this. They say they're defending Putin. In a sense, they're being allies to the peace movement, and that's dangerous. But I think what's driving Trump is that while Biden was involved in, President Biden and his son were both involved in Ukraine, and so they're thinking, this is the way they could screw the Democrats. And although I'm a pacifist, I also detest Trump. So this could blow up in the Democrats' face hugely if Trump comes up with evidence showing that the U.S. is is responsible. This could be, in so many ways, this could be a disaster for the U.S. And I wondered if anyone had a comment, but maybe that's not your area of expertise either, but I think it's worth talking about this.
I wasn't aware of what Trump said, so I can't comment on it. I don't know,
Yeah.
Bob, do you?
No, it's the same thing here. Obviously, anything that brings Trump back to power is not something that I would want to see, but I think all that we can do is try and learn and tell the truth as we see it. And the only way you can fight demagoguery is with the truth.